all of you. As Arun said, today we are going to learn about the management of pain, part 1, that is WHO analgesic ladder, step 1 and step 2. This will be taken by Dr. Arjun, who is a palliative care physician at Pallium India. He is working since last 2 years here. Dr. Arjun, welcome and over to you.
Okay, Mr. Shiva. Good afternoon to all. I am Dr. Arjun Jayarajan. I am a palliative care physician at Pallium India. So today our session is on pain management. So the principle of pain management. Different pain means different treatment. The treatment for each type of pain varies, and always the pain has a multiple phases. And for the complete relief, we need a broad spectrum of multimodal approach. Basics are correct the correctables. Whatever the cause of pain, correct it if it is correctable. And not just the drug therapy, there are other non-drug therapy parts of the treatment which could help the patient. Like it could be some worries or a fear that will be taking up the patient's pain. Sometimes physiotherapy may be able to help the pain, and an occupational therapist could also help. So it's a multimodular, broad spectrum pain approach. In pain management, our aim is always a satisfactory pain relief for the patient. Unfortunately, it's not always possible, and we will have to compromise to some other extents. Like we should pain-free during sleep. Patient should be able to sleep pain-free. Or another aim we could put up is pain-free during rest. Then we have the pain-free during movement. The one thing you should note is always set a realistic expectation. Do not give false hope. So the International Pain Summit of IASP in 2010 had a Montreal Declaration which says access to pain management is a fundamental human right. Right of all people to have access to adequate assessment and treatment of pain by trained healthcare professionals. So according to the International Human Rights Law, countries have to provide pain treatment medications as a part of their core obligation under the right to health. In failure to do so, it is considered as a deemed cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Fortunately, the WHO has taken cancer pain as a health priority and developed policies and strategies to treat it, emphasis of total pain management. So the drugs used in treatment of pain, also known as analgesics, can be broadly classified into three: the non-opioids, opioids, and adjuvant medications. The non-opioids, like paracetamol, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, also known as the NSAIDs, and opioids we have commonly used are tramadol, morphine, fentanyl. And we have a group of adjunct medications known as adjunct medications, which include the corticosteroids, antidepressants, anti-epileptics, bisphosphonates, and NMDA receptor blockers. These are the various drugs that we are using for the pain management. When we are using an analgesic, we have certain principles to be considered that by the mouth, always, as whenever possible, the medicine should be provided by mouth, by the clock. The patient should be availed round the clock pain relief, and the medicine should be given regularly. Rather than chasing the pain, we would prefer to be avoid the episode of a pain. So that pain medication should be provided when needed. That's the PRN dose or commonly called as SOS doses. And the medication should be by the ladder, which we'll come to next, and individual dose titration. The dose of medications, analgesics in a patient is the dose which the patient could attain a good pain relief. And it will depend on the patient. Then use of adjuncts and attention to details, like age of the patient, renal condition of the patient, drug profile, other drugs patient is currently on, and the drugs. Those are the small things we should give attention to when prescribing an analgesic. So based on the recommendations of a group of international experts, in 1986, the WHO devised a stepwise approach to manage cancer pain. It is translated into 22 languages and it serves as a catalyst for treating cancer pain worldwide. It's a stepwise approach to treat the cancer pain depending on the severity of the pain. So we have seen that prior to this, the patients were dying of unnecessary pain, mainly due to the regulations, unnecessary regulations on drug opioids and stigma associated with prescribing and taking opioids, which is we see very often today also. So the step-ladder approach legitimized the use of opioids. So when a patient comes with pain, what should be the first step of management? Could you please comment, everyone? What should be the first step of pain management?
Either you can chat or unmute yourself and talk.
Assess the pain first.
Any other answers? Yes, assess the pain.
Try to treat the cause of the pain if it is possible.
So always first and foremost, the pain should be assessed. So we should be knowing how the pain, what type of pain, how the intensity, what then we can plan for the pain management of the pain. So how could we assess the pain of a patient? Let us see a recap for the last session. So a patient comes to you and tells he is on pain. So what will be your questions be? How will you be assessing the pain?
Last week
By pain,
yeah.
pain scale.
Pain scale. Okay, very good.
Pain scale.
How will you ask? They don't know. The patient, they don't know what is your pain scale. So how will you ask? If a patient comes to you with a severe pain, how will you ask?
We'll ask them to rate out of 10. We'll ask them to rate their pain out of 10. Like how much is the intensity? If pain is more, break means score.
Okay.
Or otherwise we can use visual analog scale.
Okay.
Or otherwise through visual analog scale or through facial expression, we can assess the pain.
Any other answers? We could assess the severity of pain through the pain scale. So what others? What are the other that
what are the other features you will be looking for? So anybody, can you explain the PQRST that you studied the last week?
So it's the provocating factors, quality of pain, radiation, and the site where is the patient having pain, and whether it is burning, aching, or shooting pain.
Very good. Then
The last one, the T.
And the time, how long the patient is having pain, duration of pain.
Okay. Thank you, doctor. Okay. So when it comes to the WHO pain scale, WHO pain ladder, it's more of the intensity of the pain, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. So this is a representation of the WHO analgesic ladder. It's a stepwise approach to the pain. Depending on the intensity of pain, we give the medications. So the first step you can see is the mild pain. The second, the green step, you can see as a moderate to severe pain, mild to moderate. And the last third step is for the severe pain. The first step of the analgesic ladder, we use non-opioids with or without adjuvants. Where in the second step, we will be using opioids for mild to moderate pain, which was usually termed as weak opioids. We also use non-opioids and adjuvants with or without. And for the final step, the severe pain, we manage with opioids with moderate to severe pain, which were earlier termed as strong opioids. They are used along with or without non-opioids and adjuvants. And we should also consider the psychosocial and spiritual aspects of pain. As pain is not just a single mode, all the features affect the pain. The advantages of WHO ladder, it's a simple and easily understandable. It's a validated tool, effective and cost-effective, and it can be implemented all across the world. It's very suitable for home care and also applicable for acute and chronic non-cancer pain. So we come to the management of the first step, non-opioids and mild to moderate pain associated with inflammation is more manageable with non-opioids. The non-opioid medications consist of paracetamol and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, also known as the NSAIDs. So we start with the paracetamol, which is a commonly used medication, also known as acetaminophen in certain countries. It has an antipyretic and analgesic action. And the most common dosage is 500 milligram to 1 gram. We provide like 4 to 6 hourly, and maximum dose being 4 to 6 gram in 24 hours. Dose reduction is considered if weight is less than 50 kilogram. And another benefit is that it's available in rectal route. So we could use it in small children and conditions where the patient is not able to take it orally. Overdose of paracetamol, 10 to 15 milligram is severely hepatotoxic. And is it safe in liver diseases? This is a common question that we see. Is paracetamol safe? Can paracetamol be safely administered in a liver condition?
And please put your answers in chat box. Is it safe that paracetamol is safe in liver disease?
The question comes to you who is suffering from a chronic liver disease. And will you prescribe paracetamol for him?
Answers? Any other answers? No. Okay.
Not overdose. Will you prescribe at a normal pharmacological dose? We have nose administered low dose with caution. So usually not prescribed. Just in supposedly. I think that's a diclofenac. And you would prefer a NSAID or paracetamol for a liver condition? Okay. So yes, it is safe. And alcoholic liver disease, cirrhosis, hepatocellular carcinoma, cholangiocarcinoma, all conditions with affected liver. Short-term use for less than 2 weeks, up to 4 gram per day is probably safe. And even in long-term use, a reduced dose of 2 to 3 gram is considered safe. In chronic pain, the paracetamol can act as an NSAID sparer with resultant benefits in terms of reduced adverse effects and cost saving. So why paracetamol? It has a good safety profile. No adverse effects on gastric mucosa, well tolerated by patients with peptic ulcers, obviously against the NSAIDs. There is no adverse renal effects. They are also preferred over NSAIDs. No platelet effect on platelet functions. They're also better than the NSAIDs. And it's also tolerated by 2/3 patients who are hypersensitive to aspirin and does not affect the plasma uric acid levels, so that we could use even in gout. So considering the safety level profile, it's much beneficial than NSAIDs. Ideally, it's always safe to start with a paracetamol and move up the ladder. So there are few things we can consider, which are against the paracetamol is increased frequency of administration, and also the bigger size of the tablets we have seen. Even some case of cancer where the dysphagia is very severe, they will be finding it difficult to swallow the tablet. Then there's potential, yes, it is potentially hepatotoxic at a higher doses of more than 4 gram per day. Then alcoholic consumption, body weight is less than 50 kilogram, a restricted dose should be provided. So will you be confident enough to prescribe paracetamol to a patient with a liver condition when he comes to you?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. And we'll move on to the next topic, the NSAIDs, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So before going to the NSAIDs, we should know what are prostaglandins. The prostaglandins are certain chemicals within our body which sensitize the nerve endings and lower the threshold of the nerves to response of painful stimuli. So in membrane phospholipids is changed into arachidonic acid by a COX enzyme, dicoxanase, which in turn converts It leads to the release of the prostaglandins at the tissue sites. And these cause the pain. And there are two types of cyclooxygenase enzymes, COX-1 and COX-2. So the COX-1 results in increased inflammation 2 to 4 times. They mediate the thromboxanes and also support gastric mucosal protection and increase platelet aggregation and vasoconstriction. The COX-2 increases inflammation 20 folds, causes vasodilatation, inhibits platelet aggregation. The NSAIDs act by inhibiting the COX enzyme. The reason for the gastric irritation most commonly seen with NSAIDs is because the COX-1 is inhibited and the COX-1 supports the gastric mucosal protection. So the drugs NSAIDs can be differentiated into several classes. The one is non-selective COX inhibitors. It blocks the COX-1 and COX-2 enzymes. The most commonly used one is an ibuprofen, mefenamic acid, ketorolac, and piroxicam. Then here are the preferential COX-1 inhibitors. They preferably inhibit the COX-1 enzyme over the other, COX-2, which is indomethacin, aspirin. Preferentially COX-2 inhibitors blocks COX-2 relatively more than COX-1. The diclofenac, meloxicam, nimesulide. And we have the selectively COX-2 inhibitors, which selectively inhibits the COX-2 enzyme. Celecoxib and etorecoxib are the currently only available one. Most of the drug in this group has been removed from market due to the side effects. The thing is, least risky medication should be tried first with escalation if the first medication is ineffective. Starting with paracetamol at the lowest efficacious dose, especially for short-term needs, is beneficial. And despite the potential for abuse, a role remains for the narcotic medications for short pain relief. So the adverse effects for a short-term use of an NSAID, they are potentially nephrotoxic and may precipitate acute renal failure. NSAID-induced acute renal failure is very common, and it also does alter some bleeding parameters. And the risk factors we could observe for patients are those with dehydrated, maybe hypovolemic, those who are concomitantly using diuretics, ACE inhibitors, ARB, and other antihypertensives, a pre-existing cardiac or renal disease, a poorly controlled diabetes, and who are recently received contrast for imaging. They are more potent for a nephrotoxic episode. When it comes to long-term use, it's more of a gastric irritation. For a gastric ulcer, hemorrhage and perforation are most commonly seen. When we consider the NSAID is commonly used, ibuprofen is at comparatively lower risk for causing this gastric irritation. Naproxen has an intermediate risk and piroxicam has a higher risk. So we also have some risk factors for gastric GI ulceration. Patients with age more than 65 years, who are concomitantly using a steroid, concomitant aspirin or an anticoagulant using, previous history of an ulcer or gastric esophageal reflux disease, thrombocytopenia, and long-term use of NSAIDs. So it's always better to prescribe a antacid along with the NSAIDs. COX-2 inhibitors are contraindicated in heart failure, stroke, ischemic heart diseases, and peripheral vascular diseases. The cardiovascular risk is better screened for hypertension, diabetes, dyslipidemia, and history of smoking. The diclofenac has a comparable cardiovascular risk similar to the COX-2s. That the selective COX-2 inhibitors like celecoxib and etoricoxib. Even high dose of ibuprofen, that's more than 4,400 milligram per day, has a similar cardiovascular risk of a diclofenac and a COX-2 inhibitor. But at a dose less than 1,200, that's 400 milligram thrice a day, there is no increased risk for cardiovascular condition. So this is the safety of cardiovascular NSAIDs in NSAIDs, non-opioids, and opioid drugs in cardiovascular conditions. The safest one is acetaminophen or the paracetamol. We have the tramadol, narcotic analgesics. Then coming down, we can see the non-COX-2 inhibitors, NSAIDs with COX-2 activities, and COX-2 selective NSAIDs. Precautions to be taken with NSAIDs: always administer with a gastroprotective drug like a proton pump inhibitor. Caution should be taken in use of patients with acid reflux disease, advanced age, smokers, alcoholics who are on steroid treatments, hypertension, asthma, renal dysfunction, and gout. Always assure the patient takes adequate water. And in dehydration, it's better to avoid prescribing an NSAID. Also avoid if there is a bleeding tendency or if the patient is taking another anticoagulant. Please note, COX-2 selective inhibitors are contraindicated in atherosclerotic disease, cardiac CADs, and cerebrovascular disease. So that finishes step 1. Now we will go to step 2, where we deal with mild to moderate pain. The step 2 drugs are used along with the step 1 drugs. So the step 1, the non-opioids and adjuncts. The step 2 drugs, they are not controlled drugs. They are more easily available and widely used. Even for pain moderate tendency, not controlled, step 1. That's the use of, that's where we come with the WHO's pain ladder. So the patient comes with the pain, you have prescribed a step 1 drug, an NSAID or paracetamol. Patient is not having enough pain relief. You go up the step. You go to step 2 drugs. And the thing is, you can always combine with the step 1 drug and adjunct if needed. The step 2 drugs can be skipped, especially in pediatric cases. Step 2 drugs are not can be skipped because the step 2 drugs like codeine, tramadol, they have a genetic predisposition. There are certain drugs some enzymes which need to convert them to effective. They are the tramadol and codeine. These drugs comes as the prodrug form. It needs to be converted, metabolized in your body to an active form so that the pain relief to be attained. Certain enzymes in the body which are predisposed genetically are to be present for that conversion. So in some population, the drug may not be effective. And a low dose of strong opioid like morphine can be used for a step 2 pain. That is, if a patient has a severe pain, you may not wait for go through the step 2. You can directly go to step 3. So the most commonly used drug in step 2 is tramadol. It's a centrally acting drug. It has 2 modes of action. It's a mu opioid receptor agonist, also known as weak opioid. Now, it is termed as opioid for moderate pain. It blocks the presynaptic uptake of serotonin and norepinephrine. Hence, it is more effective for neuropathic pain as compared to morphine. And it has a less tendency for respiratory repression and addiction. Combination of tramadol and paracetamol is widely used as step 2 drug. Tramadol has a high oral bioavailability rather than a parenteral route. In patients who have not inadequate relief with parenteral route of tramadol, an oral route of oral administration of tramadol has been shown better pain relief. And the potency is compared to morphine is 1/5. That five parts of tramadol is equivalent to 1 part of morphine. 50 to 100 milligram every 4 to 6 hours is a commonly used prescribed dose, and maximal dose being 400 milligram per day. And the IV dose is 1/10 as potent as a morphine. Sustained release formulations of tramadol is available so that we could reduce the frequency of administering the drugs, that even twice a day dose could be used. The most self-limiting side effect of tramadol is nausea and vomiting. And we could also see dry mouth, constipation, dizziness, and sedation. So codeine. So how many have used codeine? Have anyone seen prescribing codeine in your practice? Okay, codeine was commonly used in cough suppressants and also in pediatric population. And it's more 1/10 the potency of morphine, and duration of action is 4 to 6 hours. This is the CYP2D6 enzyme. It's an enzyme that is required to convert this, which codeine, which is a prodrug, to a more active, metabolically active form, is morphine itself. The drug has to be changed into morphine inside our body. For that, we need this enzyme, which will be lacking in certain people. So the drug, if you administer codeine, they won't be able to benefit from that. And codeine is very less used, frequently used now. We have better substitutes. Tapentadol is a newer drug from the tramadol family, and it also has a dual mode of action similar to tramadol. It's a mu receptor agonist, inhibitory pain pathways, prevents the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine. And compared to tramadol, it has a better side effect profile. But the problem is it's very costly. It also has sustained release formulations. The analgesic combinations. The one thing you have to note is never use 2 drugs of the same category for treating the pain. It will not be effective, but it will also increase the side effect profile. Like a weak opioid and a strong opioid has no action together. If the patient is not benefiting from a weak opioid, we can go up the ladder, go a strong opioid along. There is no benefit from adding a weak opioid with a strong opioid. It will only increase the chances of a opioid toxicity. And as a paracetamol NSAID can be used along with morphine. If you see the WHO ladder, the adjuvants and non-opioids can be used with the medications in the step 2 and step 3 also. So what are the adjunct drugs? So in cancer pain, not just the cancer will be causing the pain. There will be other factors which will be causing the pain. The cancer could affect the nerve. It could be compressing a nerve, causing the neuropathic pain. The cancer could have spread to the bone. It could be causing a bone pain. Or it could be obstructing the gastrointestinal tract, causing a bowel obstruction, which is indeed a painful situation. Muscle spasms. It could be the cancer could be leading to electrolyte imbalances, which leading to muscle spasms. Then there are the associated symptoms which will be adding to the pain. In such conditions, we use the role of adjuvant drugs because the opioids or the weak opioids or the NSAIDs alone won't be able to help the patient fully. So we need something adjuvant to the pain medications. These drugs, also known as the adjuvant drugs, are not primarily used analgesic drugs. They doesn't primarily affect the pain mechanism and cause pain relief, but they help in pain relief. They are also known as co-analgesics because they are co-administered with analgesics of WHO ladder. So there are broad spectrum of medicines we have used for adjuvants. Most commonly used are antidepressants, corticosteroids, sedatives, antispasmodics, topical agents like lidocaine, capsaicin, and osteoclast inhibitors. It was specific is in neuropathic pain, antidepressants, anticonvulsants, LMDA antagonists do play a good role. While in bone pain, bisphosphonates and calcitonin has a good role. Musculoskeletal pains are better lived with muscle relaxants and GABA agonists. And bowel obstruction, octreotide and nicotinamide are commonly used. So the neuropathic pain, in 40% of patients with cancer, there will be a neuropathic component to the pain. The current definition of a neuropathic pain is pain caused by disease or lesion in the peripheral or central nervous system. So could you please someone tell me some features of a neuropathic pain? How you will describe, assess from a patient's history that it's a nerve pain. The nerve is involved in the pain.
How will you know the patient is having neuropathic pain? How will you assess? So last week we have learned how to assess neuropathic pain. We have learned two different types of pain. One is nociceptive pain and the neuropathic pain. So how will you assess the neuropathic pain?
Some features in the patient's history which will help you assess that it's a neuropathic pain.
Anybody?
No response. Yes. Radiating features, burning sensation, numbness, altered sensation. Anybody heard of allodynia? Allodynia?
What is allodynia? Any answers? Increased sensation of pain. How will you find out whether the patient is having a
response to a painful stimulus?
Okay.
Okay, the first features will describe you what's a neuropathic pain. And okay. So we'll move on. The direct inversion of compression of the nerve. It could be either single nerve, that will be called as a mononeuropathy, or it could be affecting a plexus of nerve, causing a plexopathy. Plexopathy is very commonly seen in cancer breast. Then there is a treatment. Even the treatment for cancer, like chemotherapy or radiotherapy, even surgery, could induce neuropathic pain. Chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy is very commonly seen, and radiation-induced is also seen. Injury to a nerve during the surgery could also cause neuropathic pain. Ishija, numbness, patient sees peripheral in Malayalam language. Yes. Peripheral, electric current-like sensation. The patient may describe as chili or chili or pepper, or application of chili or pepper over the skin. So the drugs used in neuropathic pain, the most commonly used are anticonvulsants and tricyclic antidepressants. We would prefer tricyclic antidepressants rather than anticonvulsants. So here is the neuropathic pain ladder. Like the WHO pain ladder, step 1 is a tricyclic antidepressant or an anti-epileptic. And if the patient doesn't have a good relief, we go to the step 2. There it is a tricyclic and antidepressant. We use both of them together. And if it's not still ineffective, we go for an NMDA antagonist. Still ineffective, the patient is in pain, we will go for an interventional analgesia like a nerve block or a IV lignocaine. So that's a neuropathic pain ladder. So the antidepressants, they are considered as a first-line treatment for neuropathic pain, especially the tricyclic antidepressants. Onset of analgesic action is 1 week. And analgesic action, thing is, analgesic action does not depend on the antidepressant effect. So when we use tricyclic antidepressants, we start at a lower dose, which is effective for the pain management. And it's useful in patients with depression, anxiety, and insomnia. The tricyclic antidepressant most commonly used is amitriptyline. Then we have the duloxetine. Amitriptyline is very cost-effective and very effective for the pain. Yes, imipramine is also used. Comparatively, amitriptyline is much more cost-effective. So the most commonly seen side effects are the anticholinergic effects, like the dry mouth, blurred vision, tachycardia, urinary retention, orthostatic hypotension, and in CNS effects like somnolence, drowsiness, mental clouding, very rarely suicidal tendency. CNS effects are much less common as we use a lower dose of tricyclic antidepressants. We start usually with a 10 mg or 12.5 milligram once daily, while antidepressant dose is like 150 for amitriptyline. It is contraindicated in severe cardiac conduction defects, as it tends to increase the QT interval, like arrhythmias, heart failure, but not for conditions like myocardial infarction. It is also contraindicated in conduction defects. Then there is severe benign prostatic hypertrophy, as these tricyclic antidepressants will increase the chance of urinary hesitance. It's also contraindicated in narrow angle glaucoma. Anticonvulsants was used as a first-line treatment of neuropathic pain. The most commonly one used were gabapentin and pregabalin, which are currently not preferred because studies have proved that they doesn't have a much better result than compared to a tricyclic antidepressant. The 2020 pain update from WHO removed the gabapentin and pregabalin from initial first-line treatment, as the results submitted were found to be fraudulent. Yes, valparin chrono sodium valproate is another anticonvulsant we use for pain management. So the dose of administration are amitriptyline. We start with the 12.5 to 25 milligram HS, and I would prefer to use it around 6 to 7 p.m. so that the early morning sedation would be avoided. And the dose could be increased at a rate of 12.5 to 25 milligram every 3 to 5 days, up to 300 mg per day. At a higher dose, if the patient is not getting a relief, I will prefer to move to a second step and add an anticonvulsant. Currently, most commonly better used anticonvulsant is sodium valproate. This could be started at a 200 milligram HS and titrate up by 200 milligram every 3 to 5 days, up to 1 gram per day. And make note, dosage adjustment and medically ill and patient with renal dysfunction should be taken at care. Some other drugs which are beneficial in neuropathic pain. The NMDA blockers, they are used when neuropathic pain is unresponsive to antidepressants and anticonvulsants combined. That's we go for the step 3. Ketamine is a very commonly used medication for this. Then we also have the methadone, which is an opioid drug. It also has an NMDA blocker effect. So when you are using ketamine, there are a lot of side effects, dysphoria, hallucinations, nausea, vomiting. To prevent this effect, if you are administering ketamine, we prefer to use a haloperidol preferably or a benzodiazepine before starting the medication. It is to prevent the psychomimetic side effects. Local anesthetics can decrease the neurological accessibility of level of sodium channels, and it's also used in neuropathic pain. So the corticosteroids, which is a commonly used medication, it has a multi-purpose analgesic effect. It helps in neuropathic pain, bone pain, increased intracranial pressure, which causes a headache. The drug of choice would be a corticosteroid, as it helps to reducing the intracranial pressure. Arthralgia, pain from obstruction of hollow viscous organ capsule distension, like in a bowel obstruction or the pain due to the stretching of this capsule covering a liver. Then there is hepatomegaly. Then there is pain from the spinal metastasis. The corticosteroids also have some other beneficial effects like improving the loss of appetite, malaise, and nausea, and improves the quality of life. The most common action where the patients benefits from corticosteroid is the cancer cells, tumor cells will be always having a peri-tumor edema. There will be some amount of edema around the tumor. And once the corticosteroids act in, through its anti-inflammatory action, the edema will subside for some time. That by the patient will have some symptomatic relief. And corticosteroids also have a mood elevator factor. Improving the loss of appetite, corticosteroid doesn't have a prolonged use. Studies seem to have improved the appetite for a period of like 7 to 8 days. Nothing more than that. Okay. Long-term side effects of corticosteroids: myopathy, adrenal insufficiency, and immunocompromise. Most commonly used corticosteroids are dexamethasone, prednisolone, and methylprednisolone. The advantage of dexamethasone is its longer duration of action. That the half-life is 36 to 54 hours. And less melanocorticoid effects. Considering the long duration of action, we can have a once a day dosing. Dexamethasone is started at a dose of 4 to 8 milligram once a day per orally. We usually can start a trial for 5 to 7 days. And then we can decide on the dosage, whether to continue or stop. Please note the steroids can cause insomnia. So preferably steroid should be administered at the morning as early as possible. So here we keep it a rule to administer the steroids in before 4 p.m. so that the patient could sleep soundly at night. Yes, we do administer after 4 p.m. unless if it's an emergency or the patient requests. And always consider if the patient needs a long-term therapy with a corticosteroid, the lowest efficacious dose should be provided. That is, if a patient who needs to be continued, you assess and you find the patient should be on steroid for a long time, and the patient is on 8 milligram dexamethasone once daily, you could try to reduce the dose to 4 milligram. And if the patient is comfortable on the dose, you can continue as such. Oh, sorry, you can also try, then you can try to go at a lower dose, at 2 milligram. If still the patient is comfortable, symptom-free, you could continue at a lowest possible dose. But if you when you reduce it to 2 milligram, your patient became symptomatic, you could raise back to 4 milligram. It's always lowest efficacious dose. And make sure that the gastroprotective agents like a proton pump inhibitor is given concurrently with a corticosteroid. GABA agonist like baclofen is a commonly used medication. It's commonly used like in cases of spasm, muscle spasm. We start with a dose of 5 to 10 milligram. In the case of higher doses, the dose should be tapered slowly if you are planning to stop it because seizures can be precipitated. Another drug we could use for a spasm is benzodiazepine, like diazepam. Baclofen is much better safety profile than a benzodiazepine. So bone pain, it's commonly seen that skeletal mets from breast, lungs, and prostate, and multiple myeloma, colon disease, colon cancers. It does affect the quality of life. The patient would be having severe pain on movement, and there are chances of fractures. Corticosteroids and NSAIDs for multifocal bone pain can be used. Calcitonin subcutaneous intranasal route is also used. Bisphosphonates like zoledronic acid inhibits osteoclastic activity and stimulate the osteoblastic activity, which is very commonly used in cancer patients. Then there is palliative radiation. Most protocols say a single radiation to the metastasis bone could help the patient in relieving the pain. We prefer a palliative radiation when the patient cannot benefit from medical management, even with an opioid. Okay. Bowel obstruction is very commonly seen about a painful condition. We start with a corticosteroid to decrease the tumor edema so that bowel obstruction may be relieved. Octreotide and anticholinergic agents like hyoscine can also be used to decrease the intralemal secretions and peristaltic movements. Especially in conditions where the patient is patient with bowel obstruction is unfit for a surgery, we could try a medical management with a combination of dexamethasone, octreotide, and hyoscine. Other adjuncts like skeletal muscle laxants like thiocolchicine, tizanidine, antibiotic sedatives, anxiolytics. The patient could be having a severe anxiety issue, which will be adding on to the pain. An anxiolytic could be helping. So that concludes the class. Thank you.
Thank you, Arjun, for the detailed presentation. So anybody have any doubts? Anybody? So nurses are not an authorized person for prescribing the drugs, but you should understand that where the drug is acting and what are the side effects and so what are the precautions can be taken along with the medications that we should know. So most of the time, the nurses, after prescribing the medication from the doctor, most of the place nurses will be explaining the medications. Where should they take and what time they should take and what are the precautions they have to take, all those things. So this is one of the important part for the nurses side. So after they take any after they're taking the medications, the next follow-up also most of the place the nurses will be the first persons to look after the patient. So that time we need to assess what if there is any side effect there. So if you know the most of that side effects of NSAID, then the patient sees on NSAID, you should ask them whether they have developed any gastritis or any that part you have to take. So that is very, very important. So any doubts? So can we move on to the case presentation? Okay. So Jency, you have to present the patient story today. Over to you.
Hi.
Good afternoon, sister.
Good evening, all. I'm Jency. Hello.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Mrs. Jency. I'm a palliative nurse, currently working in Alpha Palliative Care, Thrissur. My patient is actually female. Diagnosis disseminated pancreatic malignancy. I'm 59 years. Next. Presenting complaints: breathing difficulty, chest and back pain, nausea and vomiting, edema present in both legs, dysphagia. Next. History of illness. The patient had history of chest pain for 1 year, consulted local doctor and treated for gastritis, and again complained about continue the weight loss. In 2020 December, she has went to another hospital and confirmed the disseminated pancreatic malignancy stage 4. Doctor suggested better to take the palliative treatment. Next. Examination: anemic, dehydration, weakness, edema. Next. Treatment and significant investigation: palliative care, routine examination. EUS showed mass lesion involving proximal body region of pancreas. Next. Psychosocial aspects: family issues. Her husband is not family oriented and not concerned her, so she shifted into her brother's home. She is all concerned about her 18-year-old daughter, hopeless. Next. Medications: tablet etiofalin and theophylline 1 BD, tablet Perinom 10 mg SOS, tablet morphine 10 mg half TID and SOS, tablet Ultracet 1 TID. Next. Main concern: she wants her husband's care and love. She expected her condition and does not want to be burden to everyone. So she wants her death as much as earlier. Next. Summary: a 48-year-old patient with severe pain in chest and back, score 6, and diagnosed with pancreatic malignancy. Pain management: done with addressing psychosocial issues. Next. Discussion points. How could find out the symptom of this disease earlier? How could reduce her pain? How could solve her attitude towards death? How could improve her family relationship with her husband? Thank you.
Thank you, Jensi, for the presentation. Anybody would like to need any clarification regarding this patient story? So, for the medication, Jensi.
Okay.
So, is there any change needed for this? Now we learn, yeah.
Is there anything wrong that you have been seeing?
Okay, I can hear, sir.
Is there anything wrong which you have seen in this medication that needs to be corrected?
Actually, for her pain, firstly, Ultracet 1 TID has given to her, but the pain is not reduced, so that we have given a tablet morphine 10 mg.
What about others? We expect answers from the participants' side. Please talk. Teacher says morphine foreverly and SOS. Okay, then. During the presentation, we have learned. That is why I am asking.
Let me clarify one thing. Ultracet is paracetamol and tramadol. A combination of paracetamol and tramadol.
Okay.
And the another thing is, this is a weak opioid, no? So once the patient is not getting, the patient is on weak opioid, the patient is not getting adequate pain relief with the weak opioid, like tramadol, stop that weak opioid and we move on to step 3 opioid, morphine. Okay.
Okay.
So the weak, we don't combine with weak opioid and strong opioid. Once the patient is not getting adequate pain relief with weak opioid, we stop the weak opioid and then move on to the strong opioid. Always we that dose will be the 4 hourly. So, but I don't know here is why TID dose are prescribed. Only
Actually,
the 4 hours action, 3 to 4 hours action is only the morphine. One morphine has 3 to 4 hours action. So why this patient is having half TID dose? Is there any is there any renal problems or any other problems? If there is any renal problems there, renal failure there, usually we reduce the dose, TID dose prefer. But
actually, the patient doesn't want to take any tablet because she always tells that she can able to suffer all the pain. She wants to die like that.
okay.
That's why the doctor advised her to take the tablet like this way, I think.
So another thing is here, so one of the common side effect of morphine is constipation. So
Yes.
when we prescribe morphine, we should prescribe that stimulant laxatives, bisacodyl also. Otherwise, the patients develop constipation. So you have to check whether the patient is having adequate bowel movement.
Okay.
We can move on to the discussion points. The first question.
So how could you find out the symptoms of this disease earlier?
Others, please help her. Jency will expect answers from your side. She is asking you, how could her find out the symptoms of the disease earlier? Sister Alice, are you there? No.
So the patient came with a history of chest pain for 1 year. Long-term pain was consulted and was managed as gastritis. And there was associated a weight loss. Then, it was later, after 1 year only, she was diagnosed with a malignancy, pancreatic malignancy that was to stage 4. Unfortunately, pancreatic malignancies are very late to be found out. Usually they don't precipitate unless it's advanced. And they too have a poor prognostic condition. But here she was presenting with chest pain, which was not living for 1 year. She could have been evaluated, and yes, she was treated for gastritis. She could have gone for a endoscopic study, could have shown that, or even a basic ultrasound imaging of her abdomen could have shown it to mass if it was visible. And the weight loss is obvious, usually very commonly seen in patients with cancer. It is a red flag sign where we should notice in patients. If otherwise there is no specific reason for a weight loss, you should also always have cancer as a in any part of the body as a differential diagnosis for weight loss. She also has anemia. That is also a red flag for cancer conditions. So she could have been, if assessed. Okay. Anybody else want to add on? Endoscopy was done, I think, but it was late, and she was diagnosed on an endoscopic ultrasound. Yes, the years showed endoscopic ultrasound showed mass lesion involving proximal body of region of pancreas. Okay. Anything else to add on?
Mr. Shelby, if you want to add any points, you can.
USP abdomen could have been used, but gold standard are CT and MRI for diagnosis. Yes, the USP abdomen could be used as a screening investigation. It's less invasive and better cost effective and. So we'll move on to the next question. How could we reduce the pain?
We expect answers from the participant side. Please unmute yourself and talk.
Ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So how can we reduce her pain? As sir had already presented, using the WHO ladder, analgesics can be given. And the other one is diversional therapy also will kind of help in reducing the pain to a little bit. And providing psychosocial support. Like in the first class, Dr. Rajshekar was saying how he played a video where when
Yes.
we address their concern, their pain also comes down.
Yes. So we understand that, that if there is any psychosocial issues are there, that physical symptoms will increase and that severity will be increasing. So we have to explore their psychological problems, psychosocial issues, and we can try to reduce that psychosocial issues first. If the psychosocial issues are reduced, definitely the physical symptom severity will come down. Any other comments? More than medicines, when we approach the patients with smiles, etc., it will reduce the severity of pain. Yes.
Your attitude towards your patient will always help them, and they will be more able to open up to you. So we could have a better understanding of the other features of the pain. Especially in this case, we have seen much more psychosocial effects. She doesn't have a good family support. Then there is issues with the husband. Maybe not just the disease. All these issues could be adding on to her pain. Maybe someone for her to open up would help.
Hello.
Yes.
Sorry, I am not working in Kerala at the moment, so I am not really familiar with all the medications that we had been using in Kerala. But just from my experience, I just wanted to contribute a little things that could not be right, but just wanted to contribute. I was wondering, is the morphine, are we using only in not long-term opioids we are using there, or only short-acting opioids using?
You mean the preparation of morphine, short-acting and long-acting?
Yeah. Are we only using the
no,
three?
We have both. We have both. Both are available in Kerala.
Okay, so I wonder for that lady, would it be possible to prescribe long-acting opioid, like the MSTBD, rather than going with the TDS or the QDS if she doesn't like taking tablets? And then if she needed extra in the middle of it, she can take the PRN dose?
Yes, long-term acting drug could be useful, but we need to get we could go for the stepwise. We could if we thing is
we need to stabilize the pain first time. Okay, so here what we do here is once the patient comes with the severe pain, we could start with the immediate release morphine, and then we could stabilize the pain first, and then based on the dose, we could adjust the.
Yeah, as I said, the dose of pain management, analgesic dosing should be individualized. We should find out the dose of morphine where she could have a good pain relief. Then we could go for the long-acting ones. Like if she is having a good relief, or if she could get a 20 milligram of morphine, she could have a pain relief throughout the day. We could go for a long-acting 10 milligram tablet twice a day. But if she has a non-stabilized pain, that won't be effective, and we will have to administer multiple episodes of short-acting PRN or SOS doses in between. So we won't be able to know what dose she would be able to have a good relief.
And the other thing is we don't know why the doctor is prescribing the DID dose. So we need to find out. Only because of she is reluctant to take the medications, or she is having any renal problems or any other problems. That is because of the patient, the doctor prescribed the DID dose. So once we understand that, we need to go for that. So once we stabilize the pain, and then you can start with the sustained release morphine, and in between the patients develop pain, they can take a breakthrough dose also. Okay, we have a session on next Monday, next Thursday on opioids. So that time we will discuss more about it.
And do we have social worker over there to go to the community to help the people, or for them to talk and for psychological support as well?
Yes. We have a medical social worker. They used to go into the community and assess the patients. If the patient, usually the nurses will go first, and if they have a lot of psychosocial issues are there, they will be reporting to the medical social workers. So they will be doing the reassessment again. Sometimes the medical social workers also will be going along with the team. Jency, what about yours settings?
Okay, what, ma'am?
Do you have a psychosocial worker with the team?
Yes, to solve the psychosocial issue with about their family issue. We have a social worker. She went to her home and talked with their family members and solve that problem finally. And in every case, we send the social worker and to talk with the family members. And sometimes the patient cannot accept the situation at this time. Counseling to the patient and the family members is almost needed.
Okay. So next question is, how could improve her family relationship with her husband? How could solve her attitude towards death?
Actually, the problem was with in her family relationship because that's why she wants to die as much as earlier. Because she didn't get any affection or care from her husband and her own family. That's why That's why she shifted into her brother's home, and his brother and her sister-in-law look after her. So she wants to die as much as earlier. So she didn't want to take any tablets or anything, any food properly like that.
Any comments? Sister Molly? Any comments? Anybody?
I suppose in her scenario, it sounds like she is ready to die, but her body is not ready to die. So I suppose as her body is still in a functioning stage, as much as it is possible, and she wants to die only because of her circumstances are not easy for her. It is not that she just doesn't want to live. It is just because she could not live the way she wanted to live. So I suppose if there is any support that we can provide for her in a way that if it is the pain that is uncontrolled pain is making her want to die, control the pain, and if it is the psychosocial issues like the family problems like the husband and the young child who is 18-year-old thought of leaving them early, all of that things means like psychosocial support and the social worker input, and I suppose maybe if there is a need for a relaxant medication or anything like that, just to help them with that as well.
Okay. Thank you. So Jency, is it possible to talk to her husband?
Yes, the social
they already talked.
Already talked to her husband, and her husband came to her, and the last 1 week her husband is with her, and now I think now she is very happy.
Now her problem is solved.
Yes.
Oh, okay, it's very good. So because of the teamwork, finally the problem was solved, right?
Yes.
Okay. Any other comments? So here we understand that this patient is having more psychosocial issues and physical problems also. Because of the psychosocial issues, cause the physical distress will be increasing. So here the role of medical social workers and the nurses and the doctors is very, very important. So teamwork is essential for improving the patient's quality of life, not only for the patient and the family also. Okay, so we could think from the husband sides also. So we could assess, we could explore his problem also. We could listen his problems, why he is reluctant to look after her. So that things we need to explore. So and then we can connect both of them, and that is why we do it here. Usually, if we have to do the individual discussions, counseling part, and then based on the discussions, we have to try to that meet them each other. So here also we learned, because of the medical social workers and the team effort, that problem was solved. And the medication parts, we could just some improvement is necessary. So better you can, Jency, you can talk to your doctor. that for the medication part, why the patient is having PID, prescribed the PID morphine dose. So that part you have to ask the doctor, and why the doctor is not prescribing laxatives, stimulant laxatives.
Yes, I think actually I forgot to write that thing. Actually, that we prescribed all the patients who are taking morphine. With along with morphine, we prescribed any of the laxative, because every one of the patient complained the side effect of constipation.
Okay.
Actually, I forgot to adding the drug.
Okay. So then you can talk to only the morphine dosage. Okay.
Okay, I will ask to doctor.
Okay. So now her problem is solved, and then you can talk to her personally, and you can talk to the importance of taking medications. Why that 4-hourly medication is taking for the pain relief. So that could be, you can talk to the patients. And once the patient is understanding well, she might be taking the regular dose. I think so. Dr. Arjun, do you want anything to add? Anybody need any more clarification? Any comments? So we can wind up the session. Thank you, Dr. Arjun, for the detailed presentation. Now we have learned many things on NSAID and the importance of adjuvants. And also we understand that adjuvants are not the primary action is not a pain relief, but sometimes that group of drugs act as a pain relief. So that important things we have learned from Dr. Arjun's. And thank you, Dr. Sister Jansi, for the presentation. Thank you all for the participants and your comments and all. Thank you, Shelby, for participating in this program. Thank you all. See you on next Thursday.
Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am.
Before leaving the meeting, please do the feedback. It's already shared in the chat.